Welcome to another fantastic presentation for the Hypnosis Master Summit. I'm very excited because right now we have with us none other than Doug O'Brien, who is an internationally recognized expert in the world of Ericksonian hypnosis and of course also NLP and havening. He, as a hypnotherapist, he's been working with Dr. Oz to help create the Department of Complementary Medicine at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York City. He's actually been doing hypnosis for over 30 years, and he also served as a master trainer in Tony Robbins' organization, teaching others to become coaches. Now, as a peak performance coach, Doug works with a wide range of individuals, from bull riding rodeo riders from Manhattan to Manhattan CEOs and Broadway actors. So he's also the author of 2 books. One of them is called The User's Guide to Sleight of Mouth, and also Step Up to Mastery with Ease. And of course, he's creating a lot of healing recordings of hypnotic inductions and music. So everybody say welcome to Doug O'Brien. Doug, thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I know you told me not to touch my screen, but I just want to adjust this very briefly.
Yes. Oh, there you go. You got it. I love it. All right, perfect. So Doug, I'm so excited that you are here with us today because I know we are in for a treat. We have an amazing topic that you have offered to share with us, and I'm so excited because I know you have so much experience with it. And the title of the presentation is Exploring the 6 Core Competencies of Ericksonian Hypnosis. Dude, that sounds awesome. So first of all, you know what? Let me start with a question. For everybody who's watching this, either live or the recording, can you tell us what is Ericksonian hypnosis? How do you define it?
Well, you know, that reminds me of a story.
I love it.
Clearly what Ericksonian hypnosis is the type of hypnosis that Milton H. Erickson did. But what's interesting about that, and it's not, unfortunately, a simple answer, is that he didn't define it himself. And one of the ways that he taught what he did was by telling stories and doing demos. And so people often were left to define it many ways of their own. So as many people as were in the room with Milton Erickson, sometimes you'd come away with different, ways of approaching what Erickson was really doing, which probably engendered that famous joke, how many Ericksonian hypnotists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer, of course, is 16.
Why is it 16? Why is it, of course?
Well, because you know the joke. But it's just one person to actually do the change and then 15 others to argue how Milton would have done it. That's the
I love it.
So I mean, I studied Ericksonian hypnosis with a variety of different people that let me do that. And they all seem to have a slightly different approach to, what it was that Milton was doing. So it's very difficult to say, but part of the reason for my topic today is that a few years ago, Jeffrey Zag, who is the director of the Ericksonian Foundation in Phoenix, wanted to make a better definition. He wanted to come up with this, and I think he enlisted the aid of, I might be wrong about some of the details of how it happened, but Dr. Daniel Short was part of the process. And they were saying, well, how do we know when we're seeing it? For instance, if you get into whatever the DNA of something is, you and I share like 98%, 99% of the same DNA, as we're both human beings. So most of us is the same DNA, and yet there are clear differences. So what is the difference between Ericksonian hypnosis and non-Ericksonian hypnosis? And so they wanted to figure that out. And one of the ways they did that is say, how can we tell if we're watching somebody do hypnosis if it's not Ericksonian? What do we say that, okay, well, that's not Ericksonian? What are the things that make it not Ericksonian? And so what grew out of that question is what I'm going to be talking about today, which they came up with, called the 6 core competencies of Ericksonian hypnosis. So what are the things that say, okay, when we see those 6 things, then we say, yes, that's Ericksonian hypnosis. So
love it.
Yeah. I know that didn't really answer your question, but hopefully.
No, actually it did, because basically the answer to my question, what is Ericksonian hypnosis? Well, it's these 6 competencies, which is the title of your presentation. So let's get into it.
Cool. Yes. So yes, Daniel Short created this, and all credit due to them. And he had assistants, of course. And if you were to go online and find it, there's a brilliant set of videos created by Daniel Short with different people who have contributed to it. I believe Jeffrey Zeig is one of the contributors. If I remember correctly, I think he is. Stephen Gilligan is in there. Michael Yapko is in there. One of Erickson's daughters, I think it's Roxanne Erickson, does one of the 6 core competencies. But it's brilliant, brilliant stuff. So what they are is what I'm going to talk to you about now. These 6 things are what define as Ericksonian hypnosis. So number 1, coming from the famous, perhaps at least to me, you didn't know my joke before, so maybe you don't know this, but Erickson famously said, a person is as individual as their own thumbprint. Every individual is as individual as their own thumbprint. So he rarely, if ever, did the same thing twice with a patient, with patients who would come in for very similar things. He would always tailor his interventions, whatever he did, to the particular individual that was in front of him. So the first 6 core competency would be tailoring, the ability to tailor the interventions to the unique individual that's there. So why is that different than anything else? One of the teachers that I learned from is a guy named Bill O'Hanlon. Bill O'Hanlon wrote a wonderful book about Ericksonian hypnosis that, for me, when I read this book, it's called Taproots, by the way. When I read this book, it kind of brought all these things together. A little bit of background about me, just briefly. I'm a musician. I was classically trained as a musician. I played Carnegie Hall in 1980, and then 6 months later, I was playing in a punk rock band in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So I had a lot of range as a musician. But all my schooling was focused on that. I started late, so I had to really sort of focus on it. So I didn't have much room for anything else. And when I started learning about Ericksonian hypnosis, they wouldn't let me in. They wouldn't let me train with them because my degrees were all music. So I didn't have any PhDs. I didn't have any LCSWs, and so they said no, thank you very much. So they wouldn't teach me this stuff. So I was just reading every book every time I had enough money to afford one. I'd go down to Brunner Maisel and buy a new book of Ericksonian stuff, And so I eventually got this huge collection of Ericksonian books, and I would take courses from. I took a course from a man named Dr. Dave Dobson, who I thought was doing Ericksonian hypnosis, but it turns out he's doing something very parallel to, but different from, Ericksonian hypnosis. He called other than conscious communication. Dr. Dave Dobson, brilliant guy. I learned tons from him. I went to 4 or 5 of his fun shops. He didn't like workshops, so he had fun shops. But nevertheless, when I finally read Bill O'Hanlon's book, Taproots, it had taken all these things, all these, like I said, different disparate views of what Erickson was really doing. And finally, I sort of got a aha moment. It's like, oh, I get it. This is how it works. This is kind of what Ericksonian is all about. And one of the things Bill did, I'm just going to use my whiteboard here, is he did this thing he called the class of problems, class of solutions model to Ericksonian hypnosis. And I'll show you what that means. What he did, and I'm reversing the drawing that's in the book, so if anybody looks it up in the book, this will be upside down. But I think mine's better.
Of course.
Because you'll see. Anyway, so the idea is the person comes into your office or meets you online or however it works these days with a particular problem. And he calls it the negotiated presenting problem. So you say, oh, okay, this is the problem you have. Okay, now we understand. And then what the therapist would do is he'd start chunking up and he'd move up to what O'Hanlon calls a class of problems. Mm-hmm. So this is the class of problems. So it's a chunking up. That's why my illustration. And then from the class of problems, you go to a concomitant class of solutions. Mm-hmm. And from there, you can pick out a whole bunch of different possibilities for different interventions that you could do for different people that would come in with the same issue. So let me just give you an example of that. This is from Bill O'Hanlon's book, and I will recite them as well as I can remember. Sorry, I have something in my eye. I think it's my finger. Oh yeah, there it is. Sorry, that was stupid. But Bill O'Hanlon told these three examples of Erickson's work. He said that these three different children came into him at three different times for the same presenting problem. They all had the same presenting problem, negotiated presenting problem of bedwetting.
Yeah.
So bedwetting, that's the negotiated. They all came up with that. But Erickson was thinking, okay, what's the class of problems that bedwetting falls under? And what Erickson came up with, according to Bill O'Hanlon, is the class of problems was lack of muscle control. Lack of muscle control.
Mm-hmm.
So the class of solution then was creating muscle control or developing muscle control. And Erickson came up with three different ways for these three different children of developing muscle control. In the first case, the little boy that came in to see him was a slender lad, and his older brother was a big stout boy. The older brother played football, the younger kid played baseball. So after they negotiated for a while, Erickson asked the parents to step out into the waiting room, and he just started talking about baseball. You know, for the next hour, Erickson was just telling stories about how great baseball is, and how with baseball, you know, it requires fine muscle control. Not like the gross muscles you use in football. That's everybody. Yeah. And of course, Erickson's a doctor, so he knows what he's talking about. You know, you use fine muscle control. Like, for instance, to catch the ball, you've got to position yourself in exactly the right place to catch the ball. Then you've got to clamp down at just the right moment. That requires fine muscle control, which you have because you're a baseball player. And then likewise, to throw the ball back to the infield, you've got to transfer the ball from the glove to the hand. That requires fine muscle control. And then to throw it back to the infield from the outfield, you've got to let go. You've got to let go at just the right time in order to get it where you want it to go, because that constitutes success in baseball. Right? So he never did hypnosis. He never did anything talking about bedwetting. He only talked about baseball because he talked about it in his certain Ericksonian way, not like I was just demonstrating, but you know, the way Erickson did it. The kid was having dry beds and dry pants in no time. And he felt really good about himself playing baseball. Now, the second kid was a young girl who'd been cytoscoped so many times for her urinary tract problems that she'd lost control of her bladder sphincter and was having wet beds at night, and even if she laughed during the day, she'd wet her pants. And the kids at school had discovered this problem and took great delight, malicious delight, you might say, in making her wet her pants. So she was miserable. And so she came to see Erickson, and Erickson said to her, well, I think you already know the solution to this. And she said, well, if I knew the solution, I think I would know that I know that. He said, no, that's the thing. You said you do know the solution, but you don't know that you know. And that's the problem. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, think about this. If you were in the bathroom using the toilet and some, buddy opened the door and stuck their head in, what would you do? And she said, well, I'd freeze. And she said, yeah, exactly. That's what you know that you didn't know that you know. You'd freeze. So here's what I want you to do. And as a doctor, he gave her the prescription of every time you're using the toilet and urinating, just stop and start the flow like 10 times every time you do this. So pretty soon she developed her muscle control, right? Developing muscle control. And she was having dry beds and dry pants in no time. Nice. Now, the third child was a kid, and by the way, back in Erickson's day, they graded. Part of schooling was how well you wrote.
Handwriting.
Handwriting, yes. There's a word for it. Penmanship was a skill that they taught in school, and they got graded for. This kid was bad at it. He had lack of muscle control. So what Erickson said to the mother is he said, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to wake the kid. I want you to, every morning at like 6 a.m., 5:30 a.m., I want you to check the boy's bed. And if it's dry, let him sleep. If it's wet, you wake him up and you have him come to the table and practice his handwriting until it's ready to go. It's time to go to school. That was the entire intervention. So guess what? After a few weeks, the kid was having dry beds. His grades at school improved. His relationship with his father improved, which is something I never asked about. But But these are all, so here's the difference. Ericksonian psychotherapy hypnosis says these are tailored, right? So the first core competency is tailoring it to the individual.
Mhm.
Traditional hypnosis would go like, okay, let's go down into trance, deeper, 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 down,
Yeah.
down, down. Then you get into a trance, and then you read your bedwetting script, right? You will
Script
have
noses.
sorry,
Script noses.
hypnosis. Yes, exactly. So that is a huge difference, and that's one of the first core competencies. That is the first core competency of Ericksonian hypnosis. Number two is called utilization.
Mhm.
Utilization is perhaps, it's considered by many to be the greatest Ericksonian contribution to psychotherapy and hypnosis is the concept of utilization, that you find the skill that they already have, and it might even be considered to be a problem, but you utilize it in a way that is affirming to the person and useful. So I think in this video set that I just told you about, by the Ericksonian Foundation, where they talk about these 6 core competencies, Stephen Gilligan refers to again, a fairly famous Ericksonian intervention where this young woman, in her 20s, I believe, had a terrible gap between her teeth, a big wide gap between her 2 front teeth. And she came to see Erickson, and she was a lovely woman. And Erickson said, okay, so what's the issue? And she said, well, I want to kill myself. And she said, well, why? Why is that? I said, well, I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? And Erickson's like, no. What? Why? What's the issue? And she said, well, I have this gap between my teeth, right? Erickson hadn't even really noticed this thing, but for her, it was like this horrible thing. So Erickson utilized this. What he said to her is, after some more interviewing, he found out that she was working at this firm, and there was a man there that she was kind of interested in, but she was sure, with this deformity of hers, he could pay no attention to her whatsoever. So after a while, Erickson said, okay, I have an assignment for you. All right, again, no hypnosis happening here, folks. This is utilization of the thing. What Erickson said to her is, he said, I have this assignment for you. I want you to go home and learn how to take water in your mouth and then put your tongue to your teeth and learn to squirt water through that gap in your teeth. And so she got very good at this. She was like 6 feet out. She could like really do a dead aim. It was really pretty impressive. And then after she learned how to do it, he gave her the assignment and said, okay, now what you're going to do is you're going to go into the office. And whenever that boy, that man that you like, goes over to the water fountain, she had led on to him in the previous session to Erickson that often when she went to the water fountain, the guy would go to the water fountain. They kind of met there, so she suspected there was a mutual interest.
Yeah.
But he said whenever the guy went to the water fountain, she was supposed to go to the water fountain, get a drink of water, hide around the corner, and then let him have it, and then run like the Dickens. So she did that. She squirted him and then ran like the Dickens, and he chased her, and so they got to know each other quite well. And like many Erickson stories, they got married and lived happily ever after, and had the 5 children, as it were. So yeah. So that's the second core competency, is utilization, utilizing what the person has and is bringing to it in a creative, generative, constructive way.
Perfect. I'm just wondering, when people start with learning about personal development, hypnosis, NLP, and any, method in this field, I kind of like see it like first, you learn the very basics, which is like, this is a trance state, this is the wakefulness state, this is this technique. And then this technique is done 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, like, very clear steps. Like, like you're talking about earlier with, you do the induction, you do the deepening, then you take the script, and then you're done the session. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like how people are learning to do interventions in the very beginning. what you are referring to right now with utilization and all the other competencies that you are presenting in your session, it's kind of like way above this level. It's like at this point, you're not doing any technique. But my question, this is a long introduction, but my question is, how do you transit from very simple step-by-step techniques to utilization? What is it required to do such a step up?
Darn, that's a good question. Well, I'll tell you, first of all, to understand that it's a thing, to recognize and appreciate that there is such a thing as being strategic and being utilizing and doing these things. That hypnosis is a great deal more than that. When I mentioned before that Erickson said that every individual is as individual as their own thumbprint, that wasn't just a nice quote that Erickson had on his wallpaper. He lived by that.
Yeah.
He lived by that, and he was always recognizing that people are in trances all the time. We live in trance states.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful book by Stephen Wolinski called Trances People Live, which talks about that. We live in trance. So Erickson was not so much about, can I get somebody into a trance or not? His question is, well, how do I utilize the trance that they're in? And how do we make it so that it's not like, can I wake them up out of the trance that they're in all the time? It's like, no, we're all in trances. We have to be in trances. Dave Dobson, my teacher Dave Dobson, would famously ask people in his classes if they could do this. And by the way, when I was working with Dr. Oz at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, I often would teach an introductory class to hypnosis to the first-year medical students. And so I would do this with the first-year medical students. This is at Columbia University in New York City. Kind of how that. Yeah. And so I would say, how many people can do this? And these kids would be going, yeah, I can. I said, okay. And I always expected somebody to be able to answer this question. Nobody ever did. I said, okay, how many people can name the muscles? There are 153 muscles between the tips of your fingers and where it all connects back here. How many people can name all those muscles? Nobody ever could. But what I wanted to ask then next is if they could name those muscles, is how specifically do they get their brain to send a message to the certain part of the muscles to contract and certain other of the muscles to relax in order to make this happen? Because it's not a conscious process, right? Language, we're talking here right now, I'm making sounds, you're discerning them, figuring out, that's not a conscious process. If I suddenly switched languages to a language you didn't understand and said something like Ochen Horosho, or whatever, probably you know that. But how many languages do you speak, Eugene?
Just two, but I understood, Ochen Horosho, that's Russian, and I know what that means. Yeah.
So I can't fool you. But anyway, if I managed to say something that you didn't understand, your brain would go through however many years old you are, like for 40 years of files, 50 years of files, in a nanosecond, and say, I don't know what it means. Just done. But instead what it's doing is it's taking these sounds that I'm making, going to certain files and making language, making understanding, making communication. That's an other than conscious process. It's an unconscious process. So the idea that we are in trance all the time is central to Erickson's work. So it's not, can I get somebody into a trance? It's how do I get them into a trance that's functional and useful and going to be a benefit for them going forward.
Right.
So
that's a big and it's so wonderful that we have this conversation here, because that's a big shift in many people's minds when they go to a hypnosis course, because they say, I'm going to learn hypnosis, which is a bunch of techniques. Whereas what you just said, it's not just a bunch of techniques. It's even more than a system, I would say. It's like, like a completely different vision of understanding the human being and the human psyche.
Yeah, I concur. Which is why, people talk about Ericksonian hypnosis versus other forms. And to me, it's just, it's more of than learning a technique. It's learning a whole, like another language. It's a whole other way of thinking about things. These
Awesome.
6 core competencies are really kind of a core way of understanding that, language, if you will, that way of thinking about thinking. Um, but one of the things I have endeavored to do over the years that I've been learning it myself and then teaching it to others is to find ways similar to the way I taught music that I can take these rather complex skill sets and break them down into a place where, a child can begin to learn it and then get competent at it as they go along. How can I explain these concepts to an 8th grader so that they can
Yeah.
really get them in a way? And then develop sort of exercises, techniques, like go home and practice your scales, that you can do as a hypnotherapist, that these things that you can, practice and get better at, language patterns, storytelling, etc., to get better and better at being able to do this.
Mm,
Yeah,
wonderful.
fascinating. And one of the things also true, Erickson was always curious. He had this insatiable curiosity, and to his dying day, he was curious about the next individual that would come in to see him. He pretty literally worked till the day he died, but he was always doing this stuff. He's always saying, well, how is this person different than everyone else? And how can I explore and get into their system, their hypnotic state with them so you can pace them and then lead them, which is, of course, one of the things NLP took from Ericksonian Hypnosis is the idea of pacing and then leading. Much of
Yeah.
NLP is derived from, the work of Erickson, through Bandler and Grinder's work with him.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. So let's go to the third competency.
I forgot. I'm sorry. just kidding. I'm kidding.
Oh,
So,
it sounds
yeah.
good.
Thank you. So this third core competency is being strategic.
Okay.
And, by the way, the first 2, I think, may be very, very different from traditional hypnosis. Some of these things are going to be somewhat traditional. In hypnosis, we often are this. We are strategic. In perhaps traditional psychotherapy, we're not, therapists are not necessarily so strategic. They listen. They say, oh, how do you think about that? How do you feel about that? When they sit back and listen and let things unfold over time. In Ericksonian hypnosis, the therapist is strategic. The therapist is thinking, okay, how do we get this person from, their presenting problem to a solution to this? How do we bridge that gap between the two? One of the things I learned from a fellow named David Gordon in his wonderful book about therapeutic trance, which I think it might have been the title for the book, is that when a person comes into your office, they often are in a state like A, and they want to get to, let's say, a new state, a desired state, let's say it's C, but they don't know how to bridge that gap. So in Gordon's book, what he said that you do for creating a therapeutic metaphor is you translate these situations to an analogous situation, and you create a therapeutic story, therapeutic metaphor, which does bridge that gap and creates a analogous way that they get from X to Y to Z, analogous to A filling in the blank for C. But it is always that outcome of getting to the desired state. So it's strategic, it's bridging that gap. Whereas, again, often traditional therapy might not be thinking that way. They let the client unfold it. Here, the therapist is the person planning that. Sure.
Can you give us an example of this strategy, like with the analogy, the analogous strategy, like how, an example like here is a client coming with this problem, he wants the solution, and then you help that client by creating an analogous story wherein you also provided kind of an idea to the solution.
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I can. So
Fine.
I've thought this before. So yes, Eugene. So from David Gordon's book, since I referenced it already, he come up with, if I remember correctly, his analogy was this: he had a family who came in for therapy, consisting of a father, a mother, husband, wife, and a child, and they were having troubles. The kid was rebelling and not doing his homework. There's arguments between the mother and the father. So all this stuff was happening. They wanted, of course, to be a happy, well-knit, well-adjusted family, and yet it wasn't working out that way. So according to, again, David Gordon's book, as best I remember, he put this through some lenses, and he created this analogous kind of scenario where he said there was once upon a time, there was a sailing ship back in the old days, where it was all sails and wind and before electric motors or coal motors or engines. So it was a sailing ship back many, many, many years ago. And on this ship, there was a captain and a first officer and a crewman.
Yeah.
So they set sail. They were setting sail for the new world. They wanted to travel successfully to the new world, from the old to the new. And so they set sail, and as they were sailing across the seven seas, they ran into heavy winds and storms and sea monsters and various things that were impaling them
That's Dracula with the impaling. But
they were threatening them. Let's use that word. They were threatening them. And so, their previous way of arguing and saying, no, I'm the boss, no, I'm the boss, no, I'm the boss, didn't work. They had to find a way to come together as a crew to really find a way through to survive. And that's how they finally made it to this new world where they lived happily ever after, of course.
mm-hmm.
So it'd be something like that. It's not a great example, but it's close.
Yeah, no, yeah, I like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a pretty good story, actually, because and especially I would think that it would work even at a bigger degree if the story would be kind of like relatable to the client. Like if the client comes with, like, the client is a doctor, you kind of like create a story that he can relate to, or if he's an IT guy, you make a story that he can relate to.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And if you recall from my earlier example of the class of problems, class of solutions,
yeah,
what Dave Dobson would call what Erickson did, Dave Dobson referred to that as a meta 5.
Okay.
So it's not just a metaphor, it's next level up. It's a meta 5.
Meta 5, okay, I like that.
So, but the reason he called it that is because Erickson found out the inner workings of this child, the boy who played baseball,
Yeah.
and his brother who played football. And so Erickson used that to create basically a therapeutic metaphor. He didn't come out and say, well, that means you should, have dry beds and stop wetting your bed. He never said anything like that. He just talked about baseball. Erickson often would never tell the moral to the story. He would tell a story and trust the other than conscious, or the unconscious, how Erickson would put it, sometimes subconscious. You would trust the person's subconscious to make the meaning that's right for the person. Right? So he would tell the story. Erickson told a story about baseball playing to that boy, and he figured out that it meant fine muscle control, bedwetting. So that's one of the real hallmarks of it, is that if you can get close to the person's inner workings, if you can tell a metaphor that resonates with the person, it's going to work better. I sometimes have told a story about the best football team ever in the world. The Buffalo Bills. I'm sure you knew what I was talking about. I'm from Buffalo, and a number of years ago, there was a football team there, Buffalo Bills, with quarterback Jim Kelly, and they did really, really well up until like the championship game, the Super Bowl, in which they lost 4 times in a row. But what was interesting about their coach is he was a man of letters. He was a Harvard graduate. You don't get that often in the NFL coaching ranks. And so he would motivate the guys by talking. And he was also, by the way, old. He was the oldest coach in the NFL at the time. I think he was in his 70s back then when they were playing for the championship. So he would often motivate his guys by talking about World War II and about, tanks and things. And these guys had no reference. These guys had been born like in 1960 or 1970, maybe some of them. So they had no reference for World War II. And this is, he's telling these war stories because that was his generation.
Yeah.
Right? but they had no resonance with it at all. It's a good metaphor, but it didn't resonate with them. They kind of
Yeah.
understood what he meant, but it didn't get them. So I think that's kind of an interesting example, because
Yeah.
it was a good metaphor. They understood what he meant, but it was kind of like they made conscious choice,
Yeah.
what I'm trying to say,
Selection, I guess.
conscious understanding, rather than
Hmm. Hmm.
unconscious motivation.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Got it. Got it.
So yes, so third core competency is strategic. Fourth core competency is, they call it destabilization in the Ericksonian world. They call it destabilization. So in other words, it's an ability to destabilize their previous psychological patterning in order to encourage flexibility and learning. So Erickson believed that learning new patterns, new ways of thinking were integral to, change. And, I've often quoted my teacher, Dave Dobson, where he said, you're going to outgrow the old way and grow into a new way. He would throw that into different stories. But often in NLP, we talk about pattern interrupts.
Hmm.
You interrupt the pattern. So while somebody is starting to do something, you interrupt the pattern, and then they go like, oh, where am I? And so it's that pattern interrupt idea that NLP borrowed from Ericksonian
Uh-huh.
Hypnosis, which is what this destabilization is all about.
So you would say that pattern interrupt is actually destabilization. It's the same thing. Is that what you're saying?
In my definition of it is,
Hmm.
the Ericksonians might disagree with me. I don't
Yeah,
have.
of course, it doesn't matter. Yeah, it's, I'm asking you. I'm not asking the Ericksonians. I'm asking you.
Yes. So yes, so that is the definition of it for sure. So, yes. So
Thus spake Doug.
yes, thus spake, thus, yes, thank you. So in order to grow into a new pattern, you also have to unlearn the old pattern. So it's destabilizing and taking away the old pattern in order to create a new pattern. You sort of
Yeah.
take down the old foundation, the old house, in order to build a new house. So, the idea of destabilizing, of interrupting the pattern so that it doesn't work so functionally anymore, to do what my teacher Dave Dobson used to call dehypnosis.
Hmm.
Right? So it's not so much can I hypnotize somebody, but they're in a trance that's not working real good.
Yeah.
How do we dehypnotize them from doing that silly stuff that they've been doing? Right? So how do we
This
interrupt that pattern and destabilize that?
and this is so funny that you mentioned this, because oftentimes people would like to solve an issue, but they say, I'm afraid to do hypnosis because I'm afraid I'm not gonna have control anymore. And I say, well, if you had control, you wouldn't come to me, because you would fix your own issue. Now you cannot fix your own issue because you don't have control over it, and you're asking for help. So you don't really have control.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this destabilization would be a temporary period, of course, where they
Hmm.
were, feeling like, well, this old pattern isn't working anymore. I can't do this anymore. So what I would often do, like I used to travel to the United States doing smoking cessation and weight loss group hypnosis for people. I've literally thousands of people, 100, maybe tens of thousands of people I've hypnotized for smoking cessation and weight loss over the years. In groups,
Yeah.
50, 100 at a time. So one of the things I got them to do is to throw away their cigarettes. So at the end of the seminar, they'd all crush their cigarettes, say goodbye, and throw away their cigarettes, because that would meant the old pattern's been destabilized. They can't do that anymore. I made them also commit to giving it at least 3 days, where they would try these new patterns on for size. So they would go home. I would do, of course, hypnosis within the workshop, but then they'd also go home with their cassette tape in the old days, CD later on, where they would, and then finally we gave them linked to an MP3, because then I just quit entirely. But
Yeah.
but yeah, had them commit, have them commit that every day they would listen to this thing for the next 21 days in a row.
Mhm.
So hopefully by after 3 days they've quit smoking, they've gotten the nicotine out of their body, they've started using hypnosis daily for 21 days, and we did amazingly well. The success rate was phenomenal for this quitting smoking seminar, but it was partially the destabilization by getting rid of the cigarettes. That happened.
I understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
And were you doing like a one session, group session, quit smoking?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yes. And you might think, how can I apply all of this stuff to group hypnosis? And the answer is, I didn't.
Well, thank you for clearing that out.
Because, yeah, when you're doing 100 people at a time, it's really hard to notice their individual patterns. And
Yeah.
but there were things that were Ericksonian in nature. There were lots of metaphors, a lot of embedded commands, the language patterns, et cetera, that were have codified through NLP and Richard Bandler and John Grinder, but that Erickson did with these language patterns and metaphors that were certainly in the seminar.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. So we are moving on to pattern number 5, right?
Yes. 5. Yes. Ericksonian hypnosis often has an element of being experiential. So experiential. So that it's a process of learning through experience. As we all know, we've all had the experience of learning from our mistakes, and Erickson liked that you learn through doing, you learn through the process. So if he could, he would have people do things like practice stopping and starting, handwriting stuff. He'd have people go climb a mountain that was nearby his house in Phoenix that at the time was called Squaw Peak. He'd have people go climb that with a particular assignment involved. He might say, okay, notice halfway up, there's a section where there are some fossils. And I want you to find a particular fossil. There's one there that I noticed just yesterday as I was walking up there that I'm sure is going to call out to you. So as soon as you find that fossil, I want you to bring it back to me. But don't come back until you found that fossil. And he'd have them do these experiential things, if possible. And if he wasn't possible to do that, he often would do that in trance. He would say, okay, long time ago, I was canoeing my boat. And as a young man, I'd suffered from the polio thing that I had, so I was taking this canoe trip. And you can imagine what it'd be like to be going down a canoe on an open river, nice, easy river, just going along pretty easily. But then I started to notice that the boat was moving pretty quickly, even though I wasn't paddling any quicker. It was moving a good deal faster. And then I noticed that there were some rapids coming up pretty soon. And so then you tell a story about going into these rapids and going through and holding on for dear life. And you tell these stories. And so the person was experiencing it vicariously, through the storytelling. And Erickson had the ability to take any story really and make it personal to the person through his use of what we now call Ericksonian hypnotic language patterns. So he would say, and then I realized that you can do anything when you put your mind to it. And he'd switch from the talking about himself to you, and so then it becomes a hypnotic suggestion within the form of the story. So they've embedded these questions right into the story. So he would either have them do something experiential or he'd have them experiencing something as vicariously experiential as they could through the brilliant storytelling that he did.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I love this. And, as you're talking about this story, I was also like, as you're doing the canoeing thing, I was like, oh, canoeing. So it's like, yeah, I could like see the river right there.
Yeah, that's the brilliant thing about human beings are wired for stories. We're wired for stories. I can't tell you. I mean, I teach this thing on sleight of mouth. I wrote a book called The User's Guide to Sleight of Mouth, which I think you mentioned in the introduction.
Yeah.
And I was working with the guy just this morning. I'm not making this up. This is a true story.
Yeah.
It is a story, but it's a true story as well. I was working with the guy just this morning who was saying, well, what patterns do you use? What order do you use them in? What's the best pattern to use? And I said, well, the best pattern is the metaphor pattern, is the analogy pattern, I think. Very often I've gotten, 9/10 of a way, through to a belief change, and there's something stopping them. But then if I can tell a metaphor, tell an analogy, tell a story, they go like, oh yeah, got it, right? And it just resonates with us. We love stories. People love stories. So if you can get a good story that captures the imagination, captures the attention, and then delivers a message, you're cooking with gas. Awesome possum.
Awesome possum. Totally. It is fantastic. I'm telling you. So, so how do you segue between all of these different, competencies? Like, how do you know which one to choose, which one to utilize with a certain client in a certain situation?
It sounds a lot like my sleight of mouth question guy from before. There's no segueing between them. They are all there, present and accountable. We're always, I think, that you're always doing all of them. You're always tailoring. You're always thinking about how do you utilize stuff. It's all something that's happening. When Erickson worked with a woman with a gap between her teeth, he was tailoring something specifically for her. He was utilizing what was something that was true for her. He was being strategic in his plan for, having her learn to shoot the water and then do the shooting at the water with the guy and then run. So that was all the big strategy that he was doing. So, and he was destabilizing the old pattern where she was thinking she was going to kill herself. Now she's have this lovely life. So he was doing all these things. It was an experiential thing. It wasn't like, sit down, let me put you in trance and tell you what you're going to do. It was all that. And it was also the sixth core competency, which is being naturalistic. So the idea in Ericksonian hypnosis is that we have all the resources we need inside us right now and all the time to accomplish what we want to accomplish in life, to be what we want to be in life. It's all there. We just need to get access to it. And it's natural. It's natural for us to evolve and to grow and to learn. It's natural for us to generatively move forward to a new way of thinking if we can destabilize the old pattern and move on to a new pattern, show a kind of pathway to it. It is naturalistic to do that. It's naturalistic to move towards that thing in a generative kind of way. Yeah. So that is also there. Erickson has that assumption that is going to happen. And when he worked with the woman with blowing the water through her teeth, all those previous 5 things were there, and his underlying belief that it was going to be natural for her to meet this guy in this way, and then one thing would lead to another, and they would figure it out from there, which they did.
Yeah.
Erickson taught that each being is a part of nature. We are a part of nature, and therefore endowed with certain universal powers of nature. And for those of you, growth and learning and freedom as inherent in all living things.
Got it. So let's go to the last of the competencies,
That
number
was the
6.
I just did it. You weren't that was number 6. That was number 6. So being naturalistic is Erickson's the 6th core competency.
Okay. All right. It just got I was listening, and then I kind of got into this trance where you were. How did that happen?
That has never happened to me before.
No.
God, amazing.
Jesus. Because you're answering my question. You're answering my question about how do you segue between them, and then you tricked me.
Yeah, I did. So I said all 5 from there, and then it also included the 6th one, which is being naturalistic.
Right.
So Erickson had this underlying belief that it's a readiness to create the expectation that change will occur naturally and automatically. That's
how. And here's the question that I can hear from so many people who are interested in studying and doing hypnosis. How can I be certain that this will create the change? How can I be certain that I will be able to change this client to his desired new state?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Let me just say, that reminds me of a story. I have to adjust my screen here. So, what was the question? No, so how do you know that this is going to be this? You don't know. You don't know. if it's
But
going
I need to make sure, because if
Yeah.
clients, I'm parroting what people are saying, right? So clients come to me and they want results, and they pay me for this. So I have to deliver the results. And if I don't, then they will say I'm a bad therapist. I will, believe of myself of being a bad therapist, and so on and so forth. So,
Okay, good. So, first of all, get over it. And second of all, make sure they don't do one sessions. Make sure they sign up for a whole bunch of sessions. Um, Here's the thing. Erickson was like a genius. I mean, perhaps I don't use that word genius very often. Erickson was a genius, and one of the few of the 20th century, I think. He didn't do one-stop sessions.
okay.
Some of the most famous examples of the work that Erickson did with people, he had saw them like 300 times. He was a psychiatrist. People would come to him every week, every Tuesday at 3 o'clock. They'd show up. I'm here for my appointment. It was like that. I mean, sometimes they were shorter ones, like we've described, the bedwetting ones were shorter, but very often he was working with people over time. And so I'm going to suggest that, yes, hypnosis, NLP, havening, these are amazing therapies. And often you do get those miracle seemingly cures where you fix
Yeah.
something in a session or whatever. And that's wonderful. I don't think it behooves you or your clients to set that expectation that it's going to happen every time. So when I work with somebody, I say, listen, I can help you. We can work with this. And I believe what would be optimal would be best is we do, a month or 3 months every week. We meet together and do this process. And so that we have the expectation, yes, change will happen, but it's not necessarily like, I'm going to make you change now. I don't think that's
Damn, that's what I want.
yeah, sorry. But here's the thing. How do you know? My teacher, Dave Dobson, said, we don't know. What we are is pebble kickers. We're
Okay.
pebble kickers. So he said to imagine that you are standing on top of a mountain. This is you. This is you standing on top of the mountain. You've got your hands on your hips like this. That's why it's drawn.
All right.
Yeah, there you go. That's it. So you're standing on top of the mountain. And what you're doing up there is you're kicking pebbles. I didn't draw this kicking posture, but you're kicking pebbles. So you're kicking these pebbles, and the pebbles are skittering down. Now, most of the time, when you're kicking these pebbles, most of the time, the pebbles will just kind of skitter off and land, stop. They'll just stop and they'll accumulate, right? But you just keep kicking pebbles. And then eventually, maybe at one point, without you knowing which one it's going to be, one of those pebbles kicks off some of those accumulated other pebbles. They kick off some of the rocks that are stored, and pretty soon you've started a whole avalanche, and you change the whole face of the mountain. Change happens. But you don't know which pebble it's going to be. You're just kicking pebbles. So that was Dobson's way of saying that when we're doing therapy with people, you do what you do. You interrupt their patterns, you create new opportunities, you give them suggestions of things they can do, to shoot water out of the teeth or whatever else. You create new things. You think class of problems, class of solutions. You think strategically. You think these ways and present these options for the person to take. And then when they do, they go, oh my God, that was amazing. He meant to do that all the time. He knew exactly which pebble was going to change the mountain. And you just sit back and go like, yeah, thank you. I did. Yeah. What can I say? I am a genius like that. Sure.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. This reminds me of a client I had many years ago. Well, not that many, some years ago, who came to me because he had a problem with alcohol, drinking too much. So I've been doing a few sessions with this person, and that feeling when you feel like you're banging your head against the wall and nothing changes, but you get like big bumps on your forehead. That's kind of how I felt working with this guy.
Yeah.
So I think it was like maybe the last session or one before that, where within that session, I didn't know that at the time. I actually learned that from him a few years later. So anyway, he told me a few years later, which actually, he stopped drinking. But when he stopped drinking, he also stopped eating for about 2 weeks. He never drank ever since, and he didn't eat for 2 weeks after that realization. And he said that to me 2 years later when I met him again. He lost about 30 kilos, which is like, 50, 60 pounds. And he was unrecognizable from the time I met him first. So anyway, I said, so what, how did you get the result? How did you achieve it? He said, it was in one of the sessions where you said to me, and I remember me saying that to him, where he said to me, well, you used to smoke, right? And he said, yes. And how did you quit smoking? He said, well, I just took a decision, and one day I said, I'm going to stop smoking, and that's it. And I never smoked ever since. So in one of the sessions, I said that to him. I said to him, well, you remember that you quit smoking just like that? Yes, he said. I said, I want you to use the exact same ability you used to stop smoking to stop drinking. So do that now, right? And then I moved on with the session. But that was one of the pebbles I kicked.
Yes.
Right. And it actually, and it's so pertinent to your example, because he did not stop drinking at that moment. He actually, a few weeks after the session, when I left the place, I was back in Thailand. So a few weeks later, he was sitting in his bungalow, and he remembered me saying that. And that's when it clicked. Boom.
Yeah.
And he said from that day on, he didn't drink anymore, not a drop. And he actually stopped eating for like 2 weeks. He lost a lot of kilos. He went back home. His wife did not recognize him. And so it's so, it's so on point with your example, kicking pedals. I kick pedals in desperation because.
No, but that's exactly it. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've done that with clients, where I've had several sessions with them. I was doing these wonderful metaphors and these interruptions and all this stuff. And I'd say something about my cat or something, I don't know, just something in a conversation. And then they'd come back the next week and they'd go, oh my God, when you said that thing about your cat, everything's changed. It's like, what?
It's like, really? All that work and a cat?
Right. So you keep kicking pebbles. And what's great about that is it is totally in line with competency number 6, which is that it's naturalistic for people to change. It's naturalistic. We are designed to function well. One of the things that Dobson always used to say is that there are no bad parts of you. Each and every part of you wants you to be happy, wants you to be healthy, wants you to be a fully functioning human being. This is Dobson, not Erickson, but I'm sure Erickson would agree that it's inherent in us to be that. And so when you can take away the old things that are stopping you and the old patterns and things that are stopping you, and you get into new patterns, new ways of thinking and new ways of feeling and new ways of responding to stuff, then it's natural for us to be healthy and happy and in those situations.
Yeah, beautiful. I love it. This was a beautiful presentation. I learned so much, and thank you so much for sharing this knowledge and experience with us. It brought a lot of new information in how I am, approaching working with myself and working with others. And one thing I like so much from this presentation is actually we can now put labels on things we do. It's like, oh, so this is utilization, this is, naturalistic, and this is, all the other things you mentioned in the presentation. So that's great. Now, Doug, let me ask you this. Where can people learn more about you and from you? How can they get in touch with you? And if they want to, see, join your classes, your trainings, where can they do that?
Thank you for asking the question, Eugene. The probably easiest way if people don't want to write things down, remember things, is to go to Google and say Doug O'Brien Hypnosis, Doug O'Brien NLP, Doug O'Brien Sleight of Mouth. You'll find me. I have a website called, believe it or not, Ericksonian.com.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. People ask how I got that, and I said, well, I asked, and it was available, so I said, I'll take that. But yeah, As an early adapter, I suppose. But Ericksonian.com, Ericksonian.info is also one of my websites. And I
Yeah.
also have a new website that's available now, and I teach a lot of these things there called
Hmm.
essentialcoachingskills.com. So
Perfect.
essentialcoachingskills.com, because I think, frankly, these skills are essential for a
Yeah.
successful coach.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So everyone, you know how to get in touch with Doug. Go find him. Go Ericksonian.com, essential skills, coachingskills.com, or Doug O'Brien Hypnosis on the internet, in Google, and you'll find him. You have to find this guy. Doug, thank you so much. It's been a joy and an honor and a pleasure to learn from you.
Thank you. Pleasure is all mine. Appreciate it.
So everyone, what do you need to do now? You don't need, I keep on saying what do you need? Why do I say that? I have to work on myself and find out why I'm saying that. Everyone, what I would suggest you do now, take your notes. I got a lot of notes here. As you can see, I got a bunch of notes. So get your notes, and if you will, share them with us, share your learnings with us so we can together learn, grow, and share, because it makes for a better fun and for a bigger, better understanding of the information. So if you will, go ahead and share with us the 3 key takeaways from this presentation. And then we will take a quick break, and we'll see you after the break, or we'll see you tomorrow. Depends which comes first. So thank you so much. Take a break, share your notes. We'll see you soon.